On behalf of the National Book Development Board, I would like to welcome you to the Great Eastern Hotel here in Quezon City. My name is Ruel Esdivera, and I will be your moderator for today's panel on the importance of remembering. I'll get right down to it. We have 4 speakers whom we are most interested to listen to today. We've already met our first speaker, who will not be speaking at the first part of the program, but I'd just like to acknowledge part of the panel, National Artist for Literature, Dr. Resil Mojares. Now, to begin speaking at this panel, nearsighted. Each speaker will deliver a short speech. We will keep all the questions until all 3 speakers have spoken. All right? And we will open the floor to questions. Our first speaker, ipinanganak, lumaki at nag-aral sa Kamay-Nilaan, pero piniling manirahan sa Mindanao hanggang ngayon. Nagtapos ng BS Psychology non-traditional programa sa Polytechnic University of the Philippines noong 1998 at masteral sa kasaysayan sa University of the Philippines noong 2010. Kumilos sa kilusang revolusyonaryo sa Kamay-Nilaan at Mindanao hanggang 1992. Kasunod nito, naging bread and butter ang pananaliksik at pagsusulat ng isyung socio-economic at political para sa non-government organizations at people's organizations. Nagturo ng Mindanao Studies sa UP Mindanao. Ang autobiographical na akdang Agaw Dilim, Agaw Liwanag ay nagwagi na UP Centennial Gawad Likhaang Award noong 2008 sa kategoryang Creative Nonfiction sa 10th Madrigal Gonzalez Best First Book Award. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Lualhati M. Abreu.
Madayaw nga adlaw kaninyong tanan. Wala naman Muslim dito, pero Assalamualaikum. Saan tayo patutungo? Ang taong di lumingon sa pinanggalingan, di makakarating sa patutunguhan. Isa ito sa mga turo ni Rizal na kailangan natin nang namin ngayon, lalo na sa panahong ito. Maalala natin ang kanyang anotasyon sa Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, kasaysayan ng bansa na sinulat ng isang opisyal na Espanyol, si Antonio Morga. Sa pagsisimula ng naturang anotasyon, may panghinayang ang bayani na kulang ang kanyang kaalaman hinggil sa pinagdaanang kasaysayan ng Pilipinas bago dumating ang mga kolonisador sa ating dalampasigan. Walang pasubaling lumingon sa ating pinanggalingan ang mga lider ng Katipunan, sina Andres Bonifacio, Apolinario Mabini, Emilio Jacinto at iba pa. Ang paggamit nila ng baybayin sa mga watawat sa pag-oorganisa at pagmumobilisa para sa digmaang antikolonyal ay tanda lamang ng kanilang may kamalayang pamumuno sa pakibaka. Maging ang mga antikolonyal na mga leader at mga mamayang Moro ay may malalim na kamalayan sa lumipas ng ating bansa. Sasagi sa ating isip ang panawagan ni Sultan Kudarat sa mga Maranao na huwag susuko sa mga kolonisador kung di nila gustong maging alipin, tulad ng mga taga-Hilaga na dati-rati ay kakasama nila sa masagana at malayang pamumuhay. Hanggang noong pagsasara ng nakaraang milenyo, battle cry ng mga mamayang Moro ang Remember Jabida. Ito yung pagpaslang ng mga training Moro. Philippine Army training na kapatid nila sa pananampalataya. Malawak rin ang paglaganap ng mga organisasyong Moro ng kaalaman hinggil sa kanilang lupang ninuno. Na maging ang presidente ngayon ay bumabanggit sa sinasabing historical injustice na dinanas ng mga grupong Moro sa Mindanao at Salud. Bago pa ang pagsasalaula sa pinagtibay na Bangsamoro Organic Law. Ang pag-aaral sa kasaysayan bilang isa sa batayang pundasyon sa pangunawa sa umiiral na kalagayang panlipunan sa bansa ay hindi lamang binigyan ng focus na mga itinanghal na nating bayani ng bansa. Maging ang nagpapatuloy sa kanilang simulain ay nagbibigay rin ng kahalagahan sa pag-aalala sa ating nakaraan. Isa sa inuunang paksa sa pag-aaral ng lipunan at Rebolusyong Pilipino na mga organisasyong militante ay ang hinggil sa kasaysayan ng lipunan at Rebolusyong Pilipino. Ang pambansang demokratikong paaralan, padepa sa palasak na katawagan sa hanay ng masa, ay sinimulan nung pangdekada 60 sa hanay ng kilusang masa ng mga manggagawa't magsasaka, kabataan at estudyante at kababaihan. Sa hanay ng mga kabataang estudyante, lahat ng mga nagiging miyembro ng kabataang makabayan ay nag-aaral sa School for National Democracy. At ang isa nga sa inuunang mga pagsa ay ang kasaysayan ng Pilipinas. Masasabing ang pag-alala sa kasaysayan ay isa sa mga salik na nag-aabono sa kasiglahan ng pakikibaka sa mga organisadong area sa kabila ng matitinding operasyong militar ng kanilang katunggali. Pero ang alaala ng nakaraan ay hindi lamang mababasa sa mga librong pangkasaysayan na sinulat halimbawa ng mga historiador na sina Teodoro Agoncillo at Renato Constantino. Masasabing mas malalim pa ang epekto ng mga akdang pangliteratura na may paksa o umiikot sa konteksto ng isang partikular na bahagi ng ating kasaysayan. Mabibilang dito ang Noli Me Tangere at El Filibusterismo ni Jose Rizal na naglalarawan sa kalagayang panlipunan, ekonomiya, politika at kultura ng panahong Espanyol, pinaglahuan ni Faustino Aguilar, at kahapon, ngayon at bukas ni Aurelio Tolentino, na naglalarawan naman sa panahon ng direktang paghahari ng imperialismong Amerikano sa bansa. Sumunod dito ang Mandaragit, ang Ibong Mandaragit at luha ng buwaya ni Amado V. Hernandez noong dekada 50 at 60 ng nakaraang milenyo. Mas mahaba pa ang magagawa nating lista ng mga ganitong akdang pangliteratura. Mag-Google na lang kayo. Kapag kapansin-pansin na sa bawat kapanahunan ng mga akdang pangliteraturang nabanggit, may pagrurok sa walang patid o tuloy-tuloy na kilusang masa mula't-mula pa sa huling mga dekada ng kolonyalismong Espanyol sa bansa. Walang pasubali sa papel ng Noli at Pili sa pagsulong ng pakikibaka sa pamumuno ng katipunan. Noong dekada 20 at 30, daan-daang libong manggagawa ang lumabas sa mga pagawaan at naglunsad ng mga demonstrasyon laban sa bagong kolonistador at pagkikibaka para sa kalayaan ng bansa. Ang dekada 50 naman ay nagluwal ng pagpapanibagong sigla sa pagpapatuloy ng pakikibaka ng katipunan at higit patungo sa pambansang demokratikong lipunan. Sa isang banda, habang inaalala natin ang kasaysayan bilang isa sa mga salik sa ating nagpapatuloy na pagkakamit ng tunay na kalayaan at kasaganaan, wala rin tigil ang kabilang panig na naglayon at naglalayong panatilihin ang umiiral na kaayusang panlipunan sa pagtutuwis sa tunay na mga kaganapang sa ating kasaysayan. Di ba't kapwa iginiit ng dalawang kapangyarihang kolonyal, Espanyol at Amerikano, na walang sibilisasyon ang mga katutubo sa ngayon ay Pilipinas. Pero iba ang isinasalaysay sa atin ng darangin, ang epiko ng mga Maranao, na pinatutunayan ng malalaking bulto ng mga gintong artifact na nahuhukay hanggang ngayon sa mga probinsya ng Agusan at Surigao. Maunlad ang ating sibilisasyon bago pa man dumating ang Islam sa ating lupunan, bago pa man dumating ang mga kolonisador sa ating dalampasigan. Kinakailangan pang magkaroon ng peking sagupaan Espanyol-Amerikano sa Manila Bay para lokohin ang mga lider ng katipunan at mamamayang Pilipino ang tunay na layunin ng mga bagong kolonisador sa Pilipinas. Gayon din, kailangan pa nilang bombahin ang mga syudad ng Maynila at Davao at paslangin ang dalawang squadron ng mga gerilyang hukbalahap para lamang isilsil sa ating utak na sila ang nagpalaya sa Pilipinas sa mga Persang Hapon ng World War II. Hindi bago ang historical revisionism o pamimeke ng mga kaganapan sa kasaysayan para lamang manatili sila sa kapangyarihan. Ang kampo ng nagsasagawa nito. Sa ngayon, umiihip ang hangin ng tagumpay sa kampo na gustong palabasin, walang pamamaslang ng walang pakundangan or with impunity at wala pang nakakapantay na pandarambong sa ating yaman ng bansa. Sa rurok ng kanilang kapangyarihan sa panahon ng diktadurang Marcos, noon, harap-harapan ang kanilang offensive. Harap-harapan na ang kanilang opensiba. Noon, mababasa lamang ito sa mga librong pangkasaysayan at araling panlipunan na namemeke ng mga aganapang pangkasaysayan. Ngayon, mismong nasa platforma na sila sa mga radyo at telebisyon. Senador na ang kanyang anak ngayon, no? Ang masaklap pa rito, sumusulong ang kanilang kampanya sa pamameke sa panahon na pumapasok sa larangan ng politika ang mga kabataan na walang kamuwang-muwang sa mga kaganapan sa panahon ng diktadura. Kaya malaki ang pangangailangan na isulong ang kampanya sa pagpapalaganap ng katotohanang pangkasaysayan, partikular sa panahon ng diktadurang Marcos. At ang hindi naman tayo nagkulang sa pagsusulat tungkol sa panahong ito. May mga akdang politikal na umukil-kil sa mga rason at mga epekto, pagsulong at pagbaksak ng diktadura. Meron na ring mga akdang pangliteratura, nagsasalaysay sa mga kwento na umiikot sa panahong ito. Marami ata autobiographical. At ang focus nila ay mga kilalang personahe na marami tumalikod sa maaluang buhay o pangako nito at nakisangkot sa kilusang masa. Lakip dito sina Maria Lorena Barros, Emmanuel Lacaba, at Edgar Hobson. Meron rin mga script na isinapelikula tulad ng Ora Pro Nobis ni Pete Lacaba at ang collaboration ni na Bonifacio Ilagan at Joel Lamangan tulad ng Sigwa at Dukot. Pero kailangan pa ang karagdagang pagsisikap sa paglikha at paglilimbag ng mga akdang pangliteratura na magiging bahagi sa pagkontra natin sa mga gustong baguhin ang kasaysayan. May papel na magagampanan dito ang National Book Development Board. Nitong huli, may mapapangsing anyo ng mga akdang pangliteratura na nag-aambag sa layuning ito. Isa na rito ang inihanay sa children's book na may kiling politikal. Halimbawa dito ang At the Gate ni Sandra Roldan. Anak ng isang naging political detainee nung panahon ng batas militar ni Marcos, si Bobby Roldan. Kwento ito ng kanasasan ni Sandra, nang 15 anyos pa lang siya, araw-araw ay may intelligence agent na nag-aabang sa kanya sa gate ng kanyang paaralan. Bahagi ito sa mental torture at harassment kay Bobby. Gustong takutin ng militar ang ama na pwede nilang gawin ang maski sa anak nito sakaling hindi pa siya makipagtulungan sa kanila. Maidaragdag dito ang mga librong inilimbag para gamitin sa mga eskwelahang lumad sa Timog Mindanao. Sa tulong ng European Union, pinalimbag noong 2013 ng Kalumaran ang kalipunan ng mga organisasyon ng iba't ibang grupong lumad sa Mindanao, ang Berang. At iba pa mga kwento sa bayaning lumad. Si Berang, anak ito ng mga leader Bagobo, pinangalanan siyang Berang, bagong buwan, bagong pag-asa sa kanilang buhay. Pero nung nag-aaral na siya, pinilit ng teacher niya, ano bang pangalan yan? Tinawag siyang Tomas. At huli na nang malaman niyang, ang Tomas pala ay galing doon sa Tomasite, yung sasakyan ng mga gurong Amerikano na dumayo dito sa Pilipinas para magturo. At dahil madami noon ang mga Hapon sa Davao, binigyan din siya ng apelido, kaya naging ang pangalan niya ay Tomas Ito. No? Ito. Pero nung huli, binalik niya ang kanyang pangalan, Berang. At isa siya sa mga naging masiglang nakibaka laban sa diktadurang Marcos. At hanggang ngayon, nakikibaka pa rin. Noong 1992, naging delegado siya sa Earth Summit sa Rio de Janeiro, no? Siyempre pa, isisingit ko dito ang akdang autobiographical ko na Agaw Dilim, Agaw Liwanag. Sinulat ko ito, una, para tuparin ang aking pangako sa mga nakasama ko sa isang bangungot noong 1988 sa Mauban, Quezon. Pangalawa, para ituwid ang ilang ginawang obserbasyon ni Roberto Garcia sa kanyang Sapperday comrades. Medyo itong librong to, ito yung sinabing nanalo ko sa UP Centennial, Agaw Diling, Agaw Liwanag. No? Meron na tong English version, Dasking Downing. Translation ni Bonifacio Ilaga. Yun nga, gusto kong ituwid dito ang mga obserbasyon ni Bobby Roldan. Meron pa rin mga akdang ginawa ng Sentro ng Wikang Pilipino sa UP at ang kanilang source ng mga kwento ay ang mga batang lumad na nagbakwit, no? At ipinagpatuloy ang kanilang pag-aaral kasi nga sinusunog ang kanilang mga paaralan sa kanilang komunidad sa UP. Nagkaroon sila ng graduation noong March 29. Dito, makikita natin na ang itinuturo itong mga berang at ito pang dalawang librong to at iba pa, meron pang ibang mga titles sila. Makikita natin na ang paksa ng kanilang sa isang kurso nila sa Araling Panlipunan ay ang kabayanihan ng kanilang mga ninuno. Dito sa Birang, nagsimula kay Sultan Kudarat nung panahon ng mga Espanyol at kay Dato Manggulayon nung panahon ng mga Amerikano at hanggang kay Birang at nito pang yung kwento ng mga pinaslang na mga leader lumad nung panahon ni Arroyo, ni Pinoy at hanggang ngayon sa panahon ni Duterte. Bata pa lang, sinisimulan na natin na isilsil sa utak at damdamin ng mga batang lumad ang kasaysayan ng ating bansa. Oo, nasunog nila ang kanilang mga paaralan at napalayas sila sa kanilang mga komunidad. Nung isang araw, napanood ko sa GMA, sabi ni Chanko, after 40 years of being controlled by the NPA, malaya na ang talaingod mula sa NPA. Pero nasaan ngayon ang mga kabataang lumad? May diaspora sila at dala-dala nila ang napag-aaralan nila sa kanilang paaralan, ang kasaysayan ng ating lahi. Salamat.
Thank you very much, Ms. Abreu. We now continue with our next speaker in the important role of literary memory in the age of forgetting, Gunita. Our next speaker, over a career of 3 decades as a journalist, is the author of several fiction and non-fiction books. He tours the country speaking about journalism ethics, has received the UP National Writers Workshop Fellowship, as well as the Jaime V. Ongpin Excellence in Journalism Fellowship. He is a member of the Philippine Center of International PEN, Akademyang Pilipino, and formerly in Manila Critics Circle. He has sat on the judging panel of many of the important literary awards in the country. He is the editor-in-chief of the longest-running political and literary magazine in the Philippines, the Philippines Graphic Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joel Pablo Salud.
Good morning. Good morning. Allow me to begin with a quote from a book by national artist for literature, Resil Mojares, Brains of the Nation, particularly that chapter on the Filipino Enlightenment. After our esteemed national artist had cited the thousands of printed material and literature which appeared at the turn of the 20th century, he wrote, "As that realm where the nation was most intimately and intensely imagined, literature had an importance greater than academic scholarship in the shaping of popular consciousness." I was a cocky with hardly any sleep and social life features writer for a national newspaper when I chanced upon a thin volume of poems, Katipunera, by poet Elsa Martinez Coscoluela. Prior to this welcome encounter, I was a screaming fan of English cloak and dagger pocketbooks, with a sprinkling of Steinbeck and Fitzgerald and several tomes on medieval torture techniques thrown in between. At the time, I also went bat crazy for Chekhov's short stories in translation. Now, let's just say I suffered this fondness for books in English because I belong to that generation, held hostage by what I now call as the Imperial Manila English Language Duties Act, or IMELDA for short. 5 to 10 pesos for every Tagalog word spoken in class. Now, so you can imagine my thrill after acquiring Coscoluela's 70-poem collection, which cost me a little over 160 pesos, which is equivalent to 16 Tagalog words. Now, fast forward to the middle of May this year, when I received the invitation to speak on the importance of literary memory in the time of forgetting. Almost immediately, a passage of Coscoluela's poem I've long since forgotten came back in bits and pieces. The poem, Becoming, spoke of the coming of age of a little boy, but one whose memory of his past had left him scarred for all time. The reason the passage came to mind was the question I asked myself immediately following the invitation. What in effing hell is literary memory? I honestly did not know. Now, in my search for an answer, another book came to mind, an autobiography this time, Bienvenido Santos's Memories Fictions. What drew me to Bien Santos's book wasn't anything he said in particular, but what he quoted to kickstart his memoir. My best memories are those that never really happened. It was written by someone really famous. You know him. He's anonymous. So if I were to base my conclusion on these three marvelous Filipino authors, it is safe to conclude that literary memory is memory set in words, one which, according to Elsa Coscoluela, will surely leave scars. To Bien Santos has the imaginative prowess of fiction, and to Resil Mojares possesses the power to shape popular consciousness. Now, why is this kind of memory important? Its importance, I believe, lies in the fact that literary memory is the setting of what we can remember of ourselves into stories, be that through fiction, poetry, plays, and the other genres, thus giving us an honest assessment of ourselves. It mirrors the realities we easily recall, may recall only with difficulty, or may not want to recall at all. Literary memory is us, our lives, crafted and shaped into stories, and they're lived by characters with different names and different faces, offering us a clearer perspective of who we are and where such a life might be headed. You know, I was fortunate to be born into a family who loved telling its story over and over and over without change or pause. And I really mean over and over. As in paulit-ulit yan. Dinner time, lunch. Basta, they love telling their stories. I wasn't fortunate to be born into a literary family. These are very ordinary people. They're not novelists or writers. They're just your everyday men and women of Batangueño stock whose tales are as proud and as rich as they can be frightening. My family's worldview is, by and large, very old. We are one of the oldest clans, dating back sometime late 1700s, even much earlier, of San Juan, Batangas. My ancestors were of landlord upbringing, sad to say, and ruled the province as its gobernadorcillo in rotation with 3 other clan members. The stories I was told growing up ranged from the usual and quite possibly embellished heroism of my ancestors. One of the 150 wealthy Filipinos arrested for supporting the Cavite Mutiny was my great-great-grandfather. A great-grandfather fought under General Malvar's command during the siege of the Americans. Now, my grandfather was a judge and a member of the Hukbalahap. By the time my father was born, the family had to take its leave of the province to take their fortune in Manila. Now, the other stories revolved around fantastical aspects of Batangueño provincial lore, which they have seen with their own eyes, or so they claim. One such story went like this. It was the late afternoon of the 3rd week of summer. My grandfather Fidel, as was his custom, stood on the top of a 3-story bamboo structure which towered over the center of his estate. Now, they built this 3-story tower to house his livestock during floods. But in dry days, it served as a watchtower topped with a mounted 30 caliber World War II machine gun. His land stretched as far as the eye could see, well, at least that's what they told me, with a sprawling coconut plantation in the east and a livestock farm in the west. Now, a commotion among his helpers and farmers woke him up from his siesta. He saw the entire west wing of his estate swarming with, guess what? Inch-thick maggots in the millions. The maggots were of such numbers that not an inch of soil can be seen. In the ensuing panic, the helpers immediately hoarded the livestock into the tower. Now, half a minute into the effort, another phenomenon occurred. Balls of fire, twice the size of basketballs, rising from a nearby forest enclosure and hovering above the trees for several minutes. Interpreting what he saw as a threat, of course, my grandfather was Batangueño. Interpreting what he saw as a threat, my grandfather grabbed his Thompson submachine gun and addressed the forest spirit he thought was responsible for the plague on his livestock. At the top of his lungs, my grandfather said, "Abay, hindi ka't sinabi ko sa iyo, ako na lang ang Panginoon din at hindi ikaw. Abay, tinamaan ka ng kulog, ako ba'y tatakutin mo?" Yes, we all sound like Leo Martinez. He opened fire at the flaming balls hovering on top of the trees, and to his surprise, the projectile simply fell at his feet. Again, he pulled the trigger. This time, nothing. My Lolo Fidel called on his second-born and dispatched him onto the very site. Now, handing over an old U.S. Army issue 45 caliber, my grandfather said, "Junior, anak, abay kalawitin mo na iyang tinamaan ng kulog na iyan. Huwag mo na iyang buhayin pa." Siyempre, yung tito ko siga, baba naman siya. About a minute after disappearing into a row of trees, a loud scuffle and 3 gunshots broke the silence. The balls of fire faded almost immediately, and so did the maggots. Now, hearing this story over and over again made me wonder which was more of a phenomenon, the balls of fire or my uncle having a scuffle with a forest entity. Several other stories were told and retold in the course of my growing up. Like the time my grandfather's second-born leaped off a church's belfry without hurting himself while being pursued by the police. He earlier figured in a gunfight with a provincial doctor who slapped him. He was said to own an anting-anting after spending a night inside an open tomb. This incident earned him the name Tikbalang. And then there's another story. The time the family planned the public assassination of a city judge, and all in the courtroom, should they decide against my uncle during a custody battle, or my father's involvement in the resistant movement in Bicol during the Marcos regime, as the group's supplier of firearms and medicine. There was also my father's 15-year incarceration in one of the maximum security facilities in the United States for first-degree murder. The Italian mafia had paid an assassin, a fellow Filipino and the closest friend to my father at the time, to stop my dad's work as a union leader. My father emptied his pistol into the traitor's mouth, thereby severing the assassin's head. It caused quite a stir when my dad surrendered the head to a nearby police station. These true stories served as my literary ancestry. They formed the first of many literary memories. From relative innocence and ignorance as a child, these stories shaped my first consciousness of who I was and who were those around me. They heavily influenced the fiction and creative non-fiction I was to later write in book form. And more than that, these tales opened my eyes to the many facets of my being. My violent responses as a teenager. I was kicked out of 4 universities for violent behavior. The anger and rage that take control over me every so often as an adult. All the painful realizations that go with a flawed, often reproachable existence. But in the same breath, let me say that these memories, set as stories, also provided me a way out of my sorry predicament. It allowed me to see the future for what it could be, free from the violent tendencies which have served as my bloodline's default setting through the years. Thanks to these stories, I was able to accept certain realities as to who I am, who my children may become, and do something to change it, regardless of whether these tales are true or not. We've often heard it said that Filipinos have very short memories. This tendency to forget has placed this nation in extremely difficult situations in the past. Now, this inability to remember has reached such proportions today that it finally brought us to the place where we don't want to be. Problem is, most of us never really got around to knowing or explaining why. We spew our haphazard analysis, often with incautious breath. Like poverty, the public's refusal to learn. Even worse, their refusal to read literature or look back into history. Poor or rich makes no difference. We lay blame at the door of the educational system, the political system, the economic system, and all that is fine. But fine, in a world teetering toward tyranny, is not enough. Worse, we as writers allow these frustrations to affect our writing. Mr. Mojares said at the turn of the 20th century, thousands of novels and literature saw print in what could be regarded as the most stunning display of literary output in Philippine history. In just a little over 100 years, where are these novels now? As for the current crop of novels and short stories, I leave you to your own judgment. Don't get me wrong. I'm fully aware of the difficulty of writing a novel in a country less likely to appreciate it compared to a can of corned beef or Spam. God knows I have half a dozen manuscripts lying half dead in my shelves. The ones I finished and submitted for publication simply didn't make the cut. For the most part, my day job as editor and journalist has got in the way of what I have dreamed of being all through these years, a writer of literature, forcing me to make that leap from fiction to nonfiction, but only for the time being. As for the issue of short memories, the late national artist Cyril Bautista had something that got me rethinking the subject. He wrote, "The condition, remember this, the condition for remembering is that one should forget." When I first read the line, my brain felt like it choked on a dinosaur bone. What did he mean by this statement? Now, apparently for Cirilo, forgetting stands as a prerequisite to remembering. It is not its enemy. Forgetting not only paves the way for remembering, it also gives writers, we who value memory, the chance to work our magic on a clean and empty slate. Il Indio and the empty pages. With the use of language, and by calling into service the writer's literary memory, the writer can shape and mold stories to become the people's memory. Cirilo calls it ambushing the future. I call it hijacking manifest destiny. See, with every attempt at a story comes a blank page. That's a fact of literary creation. The choice of a story is ours to make based on what our memories can provide as material. But it should not be just any story. The stories which work toward meaningful change, if such should be the writer's goal, must carry with it not only our knowledge of what was and what is, but what we are able to intensely and intimately imagine as our future. That imagined future clinches our past and our present, builds our sense into the gaps in between, and completes the whole picture. If we truly believe that literature is the product of the author's boundless and timeless creativity, then it must follow that literary memory is neither bound by time nor borders. It is past, present, and future locked away in the mind of the writer, sourced across the seamless fraternity of the ages, to be recalled at a moment's notice. It begins to take shape through the benevolence of language, its adjustability, malleability, and suppleness, more so by language's power to stir recollection. Now, this, of course, is easier said than done. Our past has yet to come to terms with its incompleteness. The present, with its glaring missed opportunities, among other things, is no different. As for our future, we've barely scratched the surface of what we think it could be or how we want it to be. How can we then expect people to remember when there is very little worth remembering? I don't know if he was aware of it, but national artist Resil Mojares has provided, I think, us with an answer. As that realm where our nation is most intimately and intensely imagined, literature had an importance greater than academic scholarship in the shaping of popular consciousness. Now let me repeat that. Where our nation is most intimately and intensely imagined. That is the place where it must all begin. And we begin by writing stories without pause, as much as time and strength will allow. Stories as close to home as we can make it. To tell, or better yet, retell what we have seen, heard, tasted, smelled, touched, and felt, using all the tools and ways of the creative process. Calling into service the language, even of fantasy and magical realism, to bring this reality home to our readers. This is the place where language shapes stories that knock on people's homes, break down the doors and barriers of their cynicism. Stories which insist on their right to become memory. First, as the author's memory, then as literary memory, and thereafter, national memory. As writers, we should not look at our people's penchant to forget as a cause of frustration after frustration. Rather, we should treat it as our blank page. The same blank page where the past, the present, and the future collide to form the kind of world we wish to live in. If there is one thread that unwittingly unites the faiths, the sciences, and the claims of the humanities and the arts, it is this. An empty womb is the first cradle of creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Salud. Our final speaker for the important role of literary memory in the age of forgetting is an assistant professor of practice, literature, and creative writing at New York University, Abu Dhabi, a contributing opinion writer for the International New York Times, a member of the Academy of the Folio Prize, and serves on the advisory council of the Resilience Fund. His debut novel, Ilustrado, was translated into over a dozen languages and was a New York Times notable book of 2010 and winner of the Man Asia Literary Prize, as well as the Carlos Palanca Award for Literature. He has been working in journalism for 20 years as a sub-editor and freelancer. He He holds a master's degree from Columbia University, a PhD from the University of Adelaide, and was the Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Miguel Syjuco.
Is that fine? Can you hear me? Or a little higher? Is this okay? You can hear me okay? Okay. Good morning. It's a real honor to be here with all of you and with such an esteemed panel. I was going to speak to you off the cuff today about our present theme on remembering, but my memory tends to fail. I'm human, therefore prone to forgetting even what matters, and so I must write things down. You see how that works? When I drafted those opening lines some weeks ago, I was reminded of my friend Clinton Palanca, one of the few writers in the world that I keep in mind whenever I write anything. I never could match Clinton for wit or elegance, but I could make him nod and laugh, and I fancy that was the kind of almost clever opening that would do just that. It is of Clinton, who passed last week, that I'd like to speak to you today, both because he is deserving and because he has much to teach us about literature, remembering, and what we lose by forgetting. Because writing is defiance against the fading of memory, just as much as it is against time, silence, and death. And Clinton has always been a writer's writer. He wrote about many things: fictions about humanity, histories of what literally and figuratively nourishes us, critical examinations of how those nourishments are crafted, and informed opinions on who we can be as a society. He could do all that because he was many things too: writer, reader, scholar, chef, gourmand, connoisseur, critic, editor, pedant, mentor, bon vivant, dreamer, revolutionary in his own way, husband, father, only son, brother to so many. To me, he was my friend. I admired or respected nobody more. From the time I looked up to him and called him sir when he was a professor and I a student in Ateneo, to looking up to him as a family man and literary comrade and reliable expert on our shared geeky pursuits, to looking with great comfort at our friendship that could survive bitter fights and teach forgiveness, the rare kinship you can take for granted and pick up any time just as you left it. Clinton understood well our universal frailty, our universal human frailty, and was perhaps out of all my friends the most accepting of who I am. He forgave my shortcomings by not forgetting them, but by never letting me forget them, and always encouraging me to be better. I wouldn't be a writer without Clinton. He published my first work, short fiction, in the literary journal he and his friends built from nothing. Throughout the more than 2 decades since, he read and offered vital feedback on almost everything I wrote. Literary co-conspirators, collaborators, comrades hacking our way through the jungle of youth. Clinton was my first bromance. So much so gossips whispered that we were gay lovers, but we didn't care because the truth was our friendship was so platonically pure that all chismis was petty. Clinton taught me how to be a gentleman, and that it was okay to be a gentle man, and that life could be defined as you wanted it, not as others sought to define it for you. One evening, he read out over dinner some pages from Marcel Proust, introducing me to the French writer's famous Madeleines, and how a bite into that sweet treat from times forgotten could sweep a protagonist into a whirlpool of the most delicious memories. That is how it is for me these days since Clinton died. That swirl of remembering, of all the evenings we'd talk of books, history, women, love, cinema, antiques, Vespas, pens, and colleagues, laughing at times joyously, like boys first intoxicated by life. The details are like from yesterday. Each of us swigging good Saint-Emilion from a pair of matching bottles in the flat we shared while studying photography in Paris, or eating great bulalo at Rapsa behind Makati Ave on one of those countless sleepless nights we'd meet for restless food trips, or those nocturnal listening sessions when we take turns introducing each other to our favorite music, him with his opera and classical, me with my rap and rock and roll. On those pre-dawn mornings, I take him to my favorite spot in Manila to watch the sunrise there on the service road of South Superhighway, where I'd often park and sit in the trunk of my car to watch the planes fly above, so close you could almost touch them, envying their trajectories to the world's farthest corners. When I left, finally, for the US to study creative writing, Clinton and I burned a CD and titled it after Sisyphus, the mythical Greek king doomed to forever heft a rock up a hill in Hades, only to reach the top and have it roll back down. Clinton and I felt a great affinity for the damned monarch of Corinth, and my friend cited Albert Camus, who imagined that Sisyphus must have actually been happy, because what fear and uncertainty would come had his rock rolled instead ever onward, rolling onward into the unknown. All those memories and stories we carried together, and now the looming unknown, have led me to grieve worse than I ever have. Sure, my grandparents all died, but that's what old people do in due time. Sure, I lost a buddy in high school, and the shock then was new, but so was our friendship, because so young were we, too. But the passing of a pal when you're middle-aged is perhaps hardest, because you're right smack amidst things. You have your whole lives behind you and your whole lives in front of you. Thus my grief over equal parts past memories and future possibilities. Clinton carried with me the responsibility for that vast repository of our time together, a vault containing all our discussions of philosophy, literature, art, popular culture, architecture, craft, gastronomy, and all the personal knowledge of individual identity, the essence of who we were and were hoping to be. My comrade is gone, and what safeguarded that treasure trove has been exactly halved, my load now doubled. I must exert twice the vigilance against the darkness of forgetting. When a friend's light fades, you're forced to stumble your way through new darkness. I've been lost since he took his leave, just more than a week ago. My denial gave way to disbelief, which gave way to anger, then quickly a sadness so deep it seems unshakable. Throughout, I've been interrogating the process intellectually in a way that Clinton would have most understood out of all those people who know me. In the first hours, in dismay, I took to Facebook to see the last few things he posted, the final messages we'd sent each other on Messenger. I couldn't help but write on his wall a tribute, which I guess was more for me, for us, than for him. I took to the group chats started by friends so that we could mourn together and celebrate shared memories. I flew home and rushed from the airport to his wake to say goodbye and said hello to common friends I'd not seen in years. We found comfort swapping stories about Clinton, repeating inside jokes and catchphrases, laughing till we cried. Most of us referred to him in the present tense, though some had already come to terms with referring to him in the past. As an atheist, I'm no believer in the souls or afterlife, yet I found myself speaking to Clinton as I stood there before his smiling photo by his urn. As a journalist, I'm no believer in the mollycoddling inaccuracies of euphemisms, but I felt more comfortable choosing the word passing rather than death. Eulogies from family and friends offered words celebrating his life, serving as tacit promises to never forget him. When everyone started to leave, I could hardly tear myself away from his side as the wake dissolved at the end of its final night. Still, the grief persists, but with every day, it gets easier. It has to. Our ability to forget is essential to our humanity because it allows for the passage of time, which we measure artificially with mechanical movements of clocks and plans for tomorrow. Time stabilizes us within the chaos and randomness of life, so we can exist sanely in the present. Time allows identity by fixing us firmly within the long sweep of our own existence, giving us the perspective to determine our relationship with the universe and those with whom we share it. Without time and forgetting, we'd exist in a jumble, in the eternal now, with every moment equal in our minds. Reality would be cubist, age would be irrelevant, and our own deterioration would not alarm us into the action of living. Yet there are things we cannot allow to be warped by such forgetting, because they were true, because they were loved, because they were won at great cost, because they were so grand they inspire us, or because they're so terrible they should serve as warnings. So we write them, record them, to never forget them. That's why we have to-do lists and post-its, scripture and diaries, love letters to those who already know that we love them, and opinion pieces reminding us of the need to dialogue across our diverse humanity. It's why we have poems about living and prayers to turn to, and novels that plunge us into the universal human experience. It's why we build monuments in etched stone, in sung song, in ink on paper. We cope with the necessity of forgetting by writing indelibly what should not be forgotten. As time passed, Clinton and I grew apart. He went to Oxford to study anthropology and became an enviable husband and selfless father. I went to North America and Australia, trying not to succumb to my own selfish tendencies. Despite our distance, the realities of the past years at home in the Philippines brought us back close again, and united in concern for the current breed of justified injustice and inviolate violence. Clinton and I would message often, wondering what we could do to help. With all of our privilege, resources, skills as writers, how could we join the fight against the killings of thousands of untried suspects, the victimization of the most vulnerable, and the slow strangling of the institutions of our democracy that are meant to safeguard accountability, transparency, checks and balances against abuses of power, and access for all of us citizens to the mechanisms of collective governance and individual agency? How could we use our sharpest weapons, our pens? Who could we follow in this fight of our lives? We asked, where was the old guard of writers who had pointed their own pens at the dictator? Why were they not at protests or on pages in publications everywhere, warning that history was repeating and calling us young ones to follow in their wisdom and experience? Some had brattily enriched themselves through their own corruption, like Teddy Boy Locsin. But where were the others? Clinton and I posited that perhaps they were exhausted by their memories of past battles, protecting now, deservedly, their hard-fought lives of normalcy and quiet. I think now that Clinton and I didn't realize that their words, examples, and sacrifices, sometimes ultimate, like with Emma Lacaba and Tibo Mojares, had already taught us what we needed to know. The examples were there, in history and in books. The fight was now ours. In that fight, I've tried my best. But the truth is, I enjoy no certainty in how much I've contributed. One of the last things Clinton messaged me, though, was that he was proud of the man that I have become. That moved me to tears because he, of all people, knew who I once was and always wanted to be, with all the baggage and insecurities I schlepped along that journey. I saw myself less harshly through his eyes. My efforts as a writer have always been simple: a refusal to surrender the complicated story of who we are to those attempting to simplify it for their agenda and control. I'm just a citizen, like all of us here, with a pen and a laptop, trying my best. When perplexed by the habitual shortcomings of the privileged class that chance saw me born into, I tried to write a novel to examine that world and my complicity in it. When frustrated that the dictator would be buried among heroes, I helped organize a group to occupy the gravesite first with the memories of those killed by his regime, so that his story would not dwarf theirs. When stymied by the immense brokenness of our political system, I went to talk to as many people as I could, to write about the problems and potential solutions. When the democratic tool of social media was being hijacked by the powerful, I joined others in facing their troll armies with facts, fortitude, and even kindness. And when disillusioned with the failures of my own generation, I set out to teach the next one our mistakes and the skills they might need to fix them. All that never seemed enough to me, because as writers, we know best that words always fall short. But we also know best their importance, their role in the great conversation that spans borders and eras, the story of our humanity, what it can be and how it can be lost. It's often easy to forget that. Sometimes we need reminding. In recent years, I'd grown disheartened by literature. It's the long game in a world overwhelmed by the noise of short-term promises, ignorance, online vitriol, and the urgencies of today. Literature's reach is usually narrow and slow. Its change deep and unseen. Its action as quiet as an open book in your hands as you read late into the night. Literature promises no deliverables to be tallied into spreadsheets and summed up in annual reports. It can take years to write a good novel and weeks for it to be read. Meanwhile, protesting in the streets seems reassuringly immediate. Writing opinion pieces feels like defending from the ramparts, and engaging online can offer the steel clang and salty scent of battle. But three people encouraged me back to the novelist's craft from different parts of the world. Our national artist, S02, wrote me a kind letter out of the blue. Salman Rushdie urged me over merienda in Manhattan to not swap the novelist's marathon for the sprints of political punditry. And then there was Clinton Palanca, whose reminders were constant encouragements, as was always his way. That's why I've refrained lately from the journalism of my past years and returned to my next novel, and why I'm gestating the one after that, about the Marcoses, who are intent on having the last word, and who I intend to deprive of exactly that. For that's what literature is, ultimately, in its depth, length, intimacy, longevity. It's the final word. Having a voice always means having a vote. It's why every despot tries to silence dissent. And so every poem, story, article, and post you write with care is actually practice in strengthening your voice against that silence. Fiction forces us to question the truths. Nonfiction forces us to confront the falsehoods. Together, the two force us to face the nuanced but non-negotiable difference between right and wrong, honesty and lies. How we use our words, how we allow them to represent us, eventually becomes memory. No, our age is not one of forgetting. We now have higher literacy and greater access to methods of publishing and discourse. This age is actually one of remembering wrongly, of disinformation wielded by the powerful who hijack the technological and structural tools of our day, as the Nazis did with the radio and nationalism, and the Americans with Hollywood and democracy. Today's savvy despot needs no censorship when they can drown out dissent through trolls and attacks on the media. Today's canny strongman needs no dictatorship when they can hide instead within a sham democracy. So many now seek to rewrite the story to suit themselves. China scrubbing its hands of a massacre, the Marcoses shrugging off their kleptocratic dictatorship, the Duterte regime rationalizing away thousands of deaths and the rampant reek of corruption. They and so many others are engaged in the same strategy, to define your reality, to limit your agency, and to control our minds so that we will not resist their impunity. Will you let them? When Clinton passed, our friend Manolo Quezon, the historian, journalist, political scholar, said that it is our turn to carry our friend's torch, that Clinton would have wanted that. It's true. It's what Clinton would have wanted, but it's also what all of us need. when we forget the bright lights of our society, we lose sight of what in our society made them, and we lose sight of who we too can be. The life of a writer like Clinton presents us with proof that what stands the best chance of lasting is what we ourselves create. He led by example, leaving us books and stories that will last because of his commitment to the truth and his respect for his readers. He thought for himself and wanted to hear what others thought of the world. He did his share in safeguarding our collective memory, ranging from how we feed our souls to the culture of finding common cause around a table, to the concerns of minorities that make our country gloriously multifaceted, to finely wrought stories about how we humans find meaning in each other. Clinton stood defiantly against silence and forgetting.
To you. Questions, anyone? All right. I have another question, which is, we're talking about the importance of literary memory, and Joel was talking earlier about what exactly literary memory is. And I wanted to ask, in the process of recording what we remember, when we write down something, how do you, writers, try to capture as much of the accuracy of what you are remembering? Do you make notes? Is it purely a mental process? Or is it the process of going back to it and continually editing it until it is what you think is the most accurate thing compared to what actually happened? So let's reverse it. Let's start with Chuck. Dr. Syjuco, what do you think?
I take a lot of notes. I do. But I also see writing as not just forming those notes into a story. I see writing as translating our reality. You know, as a Filipino writing in English, although English is my sharpest tool, it's the language I grew up with at home, I still often feel that writing about the Philippines into this tongue that we have colonized is still an act of translation. Well, whatever language you're speaking, or you're writing in, you're translating reality into thoughts and then into these scribblings on the page. And if you've ever worked with translators or translated yourself, it's always a constant question of how accurate do we make it versus how true do we make it? How true does it feel? You know, how do you translate jokes, for example, from one language to another? How do you capture the music of one particular language, the original language, and translate it into something completely different, which has its own musicality? And so sometimes you have to just really try for the approximations. And I think writing is, you know, as a journalist, you have to be accurate, of course. You have to have fidelity to everybody involved. But at the same time, I think you have to be faithful to the moment, the spirit, the feeling, the intention, and also, or the intended relationship, I think, that the writer wants with the reader.
Joel?
Actually, before last night, I submitted my talk earlier, I think a few weeks earlier, but then last night at the last minute I was telling Chuck I wanted to change it because there was one aspect of memory that I think I failed to discuss, and that is the science behind memory. And there is a science behind memory, diba? It's part of I think of our biological makeup. I mean, memory, the mind, or where it's found in the brain. And I wanted also to take that chance to speak a little about it, because in writing, like I agree very much with Chuck that in relating with reality, one has not only to parang take a dictation from reality, but then translating it too into the language that you're used to using. And sometimes there's a huge vast difference between the Filipino language and English, which we use. But then in translating that, we have to be very close to what we intend to say or what reality is trying to tell us. But then again, there's also science to memory. Minsan yung memories natin, yung naaalala natin when we get to a certain age. You know, when I was 16, 18, 20, I can remember almost every word I read in the dictionary. Today, at 56, sometimes I forget my daughter's name. Sometimes, meron siyang loading eh. Oh. Ano nga ba yung sinabi ko kanina lang? Or where did I put my wallet? Diba? I just got some juice off the refrigerator and now I can't ask them. They're pissed about it so much, my wife and my daughter. Now, there's a science to that. And I wish we could also talk about that when it...
And encouraged us all to do the same in our own way. That's what he would have wanted. It is to us then, as writers, and especially as readers, to guard in turn his memory. And so, I ask each and every one of you now to imagine in your hand a glass of the finest ambrosia, the top shelf, single malt, small batch, artisanal, Grand Cru, non-chill filtered, Distiller's Reserve, organic, 45-year-old, legendary, wee dram of the finest tipple. And stand with me, please, now. Stand with me, please. And raise your glass. Raise that glass high, like so, to join me in a toast to a writer who dedicated his life to fighting the darkness, who showed by example what we too can do ourselves if we try. Mabuhay Clinton Palanca, one of the greats of Philippine letters. What a life, what a light. Godspeed, salamat, we will not forget you. Mabuhay, mabuhay, mabuhay. Goodbye, Sisyphus. Keep on rolling.
Thank you for that, Doc. Thank you for that, Dr. Syjuco. Continuing with the important role of literary memory in the age of forgetting, I would like to ask our panel a question. If everyone could just chime in with their answer. What do you think, as a people, would you consider the most important thing that Filipinos must never forget? Shall we start with you, Dr. Mojares? Shall we start with you? What is the one thing that you think Filipinos must never forget?
Suppose like a quick answer would be kind of we never forget how good we can be if we really work on it. Meaning we don't shortchange ourselves by settling for things as they are.
Ms. Lualhati?
Siyempre, hindi natin dapat kalimutan ang ating kasaysayan. Ang pinanggalingan ng ating lahi, ang pinanggalingan ng ating bansa. At hindi din natin kakalimutan dapat ang papel ng mga nasa laylayan ng lipunan. Sila ang lumilikha ng ating kasaysayan.
Joel?
I was going to say sana, that I forgot. But, baka patayin ako ni Rui. I think at the very base of it all, we should never forget to remember. Kasi even that, sometimes, we miss out on.
Chuck?
Tough acts to follow. I think maybe never forget our principles and our values. I think we all have the same principles and values overall, and I think by remembering them, we find connection with each other. But in the hard times, when, you know, we Filipinos, we have a hard time with discipline, for example. You know, you'll in traffic, you'll create counterflow because everyone else is doing it. When we know that we should be doing the right thing, but everyone else is doing it. But if we remember our values and principles and we let that be something that can connect us, then at least we have something to turn to in those difficult times when we actually forget ourselves and forget what we should be doing.
Thank you, Dr. Syjuco. Now we'll turn the floor over to you guys. Do you have any questions? If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will ferry a microphone over.
Comes to memory and writing, because I think it figures very well into the discussion. Well, I have no answers. I'm no doctor. But I wish we could talk about it. We could all learn from it.
Ms. Lualhati?
Siyempre, depende yun sa kung ano ang sinusulat mo. Yung sinusulat ko yung agaw dilim, agaw liwanag, autobiographical yon. At pangunahin akong umasa sa aking, kung ano ang nasa aking alaala. Kaya lang, hindi lang yung, kung ano yung alaala mo eh. Kailangan i-contextualize mo yun, kung ano ba yung kapanahunan yon at gano'n ang aking naging reaksyon. Ganun ang aking ginawa, no? Halimbawa, kung wala naman diktadura, bakit ako mamumundok, no? Ganun, no? I-contextualize mo, bakit ganun ang iyong naging reaksyon sa harap ng isang mga pangyayari. Pero pag nagsusulat ka na ng hindi mo na buhay ito no? Iba na, no? Kailangan researcher ako no? Gumawa ka ng pananaliksik. Baka mamaya, mga sinusulat mo, yung ano lang, yung nasa isip mo. Pero hindi yung nasa isip ng mga taong andun talaga, kasangkot doon sa mga pangyayari, naapektuhan ng mga pangyayari. No? Kaya depende, yung sa sa kasaysayan, pag nagsulat ka ng kasaysayan, dapat nabe-verify mo ang mga ebidensya. Hindi ka sulat ng sulat. No? Hindi lang yung kasi ito ang gusto mong ipakita, mali naman pala ang facts, hindi ka na paniniwalaan nun. Kaya depende kung ano ang topic na sinusulat mo.
Dr. Mojares.
Yeah, I suppose you have to try as hard as you can on, say, remembering something like an event as it really was. But also, like, I'm kind of recall what somebody has said about memory, which I think is also true. And the statement goes like this, that anything processed by memory is fiction. So, why speak of this instead of that? And speak of this in this particular way, represented instead of kind of, we always make such choices. So we cannot say that our access to the past is completely unmediated. So the subjectivity is still quite there. So I think, so there should be awareness as well that should accompany kind of remembering to see as to how kind of remembering has its pitfalls and so on. So,
Thank you, Dr. Mojares. There's a question from the floor for Dr. Syjuco. For Dr. Syjuco.
That's what happens when you say my name. The
As a
devil comes
writer
in.
who is based abroad, how do you negotiate your memory recollection of Philippine history in your writing?
With great difficulty and care. I love Philippine history. I'm a Philippine history buff. A lot of my work deals with the Philippine history I learned while studying here and continued in the rest of my life studying from other great writers and historians. But yes, I'm a Filipino abroad, but I'm also a Filipino in a world that has become very Filipino. We have colonized the world. Where I am for most of the year in the UAE, so there's some 20% of the population are Filipino. There are only 15% of the population who are Emiratis in the United Arab Emirates. In many ways, we outnumber them. The Filipino experience is a global one. And I take that also very seriously, that this is a point in our history where we are colonizing the world. We are building the cities. We are educating the young. We are caring for the old and the sick. We are showing the rest of the world who we are. And people look at us with great respect, admiration, and envy in many ways. And so I've been watching that history with great excitement. I see we Filipinos abroad, all of us, from all walks of life, as the new potential Ilustrados who can come home and bring home more than just money for investment in the next Schumart development condo unit thing, but really bring in a global perspective and standards and what we've learned from how other countries have done it. So that is the history that I'm trying to be very part of. But I struggled with my second novel. I'm finishing it this year. I thought that after Ilustrado, I put everything I had into Ilustrado. I did my entire life, all of the history that I loved. I crammed it into that book. And there's a saying in publishing that you have your whole life to write your first novel and then 18 months to write the second one. And in many cases, that's true. My publishers were saying, okay, we want the second book. And I wrote it, but it was terrible. It was saying the same sorts of things. All the stories that I had for my lifetime as a Filipino in the world, they were finished. I had exhausted them. And I thought, okay, well, I'm living in Montreal. I'm focusing fully on writing. It's an affordable city. It keeps me away from all the family drama back at home in the Philippines and the demands of family. So, okay, I'll write this book. And I spent years writing the second novel. And it was terrible. Terrible. It was empty. It was flat. And in dismay, in 2015, I moved back to the Philippines before the election. And then I started to really follow again what was happening here. I went to all of the protest rallies and the political rallies. I went to all the meeting de avance. And one day I did all 5 presidential and meeting de avance to talk to voters. I started covering the drug war. We started going to the prisons, the streets, the slums, to really understand what was happening here in the Philippines. And suddenly, in those 3 years of doing that, I had all the material I needed. I had the connection again to this moment in history and also to the vast history of who we are as Filipinos that have made us to this point, who we are now. And that's how I have learned to negotiate and navigate it, by coming home. And I come home all the time. This is still my home. And I lost sight of that for a while. I thought I could always just be Filipino wherever I am. But now the book, which I'm finishing, I Was the President's Mistress, a celebrity tell-all memoir. Be sexy. I'm finishing that this year. So I hope it'll be good.
Thank you, Chuck. Are there any questions? Yes, over there.
Hello. Good morning. I am Lakant Uhay po from UP Mindanao. Since we are talking about literary memory, I graduated po from a public school in Tacloban. And one of the things that I observed sa mga textbooks namin, particularly sa Araling Panglipunan, ay may malalaking time jumps sa mga sa period sa history overall sa Philippine history. I guess ang question ko is as literary historians, critics and writers, ano sa tingin niyo yung magiging solution, especially na ang karamihan sa mga kabataan na nalalaman na lang nila kung ano talaga nangyari when they go to college, ilan lang naman yung nakaka-afford ng college kahit na may free education na rin tayo. So ano sa tingin yung solution, particularly sa elementary and sa secondary sectors ng ating lipunan?
All right. Who would like to field that question? Anyone?
Yung kasaysayan at ating lipunan, hindi lang naman siguro yung nakapag-aral sa universidad ang nakakaalam sa ating kasaysayan. Hindi po alam ng marami na nakadalaw na ba kayo sa mga lumad na nag-aaral sa UP? Mabibigla kayo, kwekwentuhan nila kayo ng karil, yung international humanitarian law. Kasi itinuturo yon sa araling panlipunan sa mga eskwelahang lumad. No? Tapos, alam nila yung kasaysayan ng Pilipinas. No? Hindi lang naman yung mga nag-aaral dyan sa universidad natin ang nag-aaral ng kasaysayan. Ang lahat ng mga naoorganisa ng kilusang masa ay nag-aaral ng kasaysayan. Ngayon, tama siya eh. Ang daming mga libro ngayon na may mga time jumps, no? Tapos mali-mali pa yung mga sinasabing impormasyon. Halimbawa, doon sa sinabi ni Resil, hindi pa niya napanood ang yung Quezon's game. Ako hindi ko pa rin napanood. Pero kwento sa akin, at saka hindi totoong wala pang nagsulat tungkol doon. Nung martial law, si Father Pedro Salgado, yung rape of Mindanao, nandoon yun. Yung tungkol kay Quezon. Pero ang kanyang version is, ang panukala ni Quezon ay magkaroon ng Jewish settlement sa Bukidnon. Kaya siyempre, no, yung kay Father Salgado, part ito ng rape ng Mindanao, hindi nga lang natuloy. Kaya siguro yon dapat pag-aralin pa natin yung mga maliliit na mga impormasyon sa ating kasaysayan. Tapos tuloy-tuloy naman ang pag-aaral sa ating kasaysayan. Depende yon, sabi nga, kung sino yung nanalo, siya ang susulat ng ating kasaysayan.
All right. Yes, one last question.
Good morning to the panel. So we already talked about the idea of translation. I just have a question. I'm a student. I'm doing my master's, and I'm interested in the Filipino identity and this idea of translation. And I've read some works that dealt with this cultural translation. Homi Baba, for example, said that we're always in translation. But I'm just curious. I realized that at some point, I guess you cannot be fully in translation because we have to retain some values. You cannot be always in translation, fully in translation. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts about how far should we go in imagining the Filipino identity as always in translation, or perhaps are there any danger in thinking about the Filipino as always ongoing, as always let me put it this way. Are there any dangers in thinking? I guess that's the question. I'm sorry. That's the question. Are there any dangers in thinking the Filipinos always in translation?
Who would like to field that question? Chuck, Dr. Syjuco, Dr. Mojares. Okay, we'd like clarification on the question. Can you state your question again, please?
Yeah, okay. I'm just, the question is, do you think there is a danger in thinking that the Filipino identity is always in translation? Because, of course, we cannot lose certain things that define what Filipino is. So how far should we think about the Filipino identity as an ongoing act, as an act of translation?
I'll try my best here. I think maybe there's a sense that translation is not authentic because it is not from the primary source material, and it is an interpretation. And by that definition, then I guess, yes, that's something that we should be wary of, because we shouldn't be translating who we are for the rest of the world. But I also think there's nothing wrong with trying to make ourselves understood to as many people as possible. And because we are a multilingual nation, I think there's great value in translating ourselves for each other so that we can have that conversation. I think the danger, as you say, is actually not having a conversation anymore about, is this translation correct? Is there value in translating it? Well, when we start to say this is the single authentic version, that's when it gets dangerous, because then it shuts down all conversation about it and the different interpretations about it. So I think translation invites us to examine different interpretations of things. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and that's how we should see ourselves. You know, two things from my own experience. You know, I'm Filipino-Chinese, Spanish, American. All the history of our country runs through my veins in the colonial history. And because of that, I always had a hard time trying to figure out who my identity is. But I'm nothing else but Filipino. And going abroad, you know, in the UAE, whenever I speak Tagalog, they say, "Ay, kala kong ibang lahi." Like, but why? I mean, we Filipinos we're mixed. That's one of the great things about us. And because we have that diversity, there is that necessity to translate, I think, also, sometimes for each other. And the second thing is, when I wrote my book, Ilustrado, I thought, okay, who am I writing this for? I think as writers, we all think, who are we writing this for? And I came to this conclusion that I'm writing it for everyone. There are some things in the book that some Filipinos will not get. And there's some things in the book that many foreigners won't get. But if you can write a piece that is rich enough and with a good story, with a good momentum, with good everything, that even though things are missed in translation, as long as what remains is enough for the person who's reading it in that very intimate writer-reader relationship, then you've done something very good. And I think that's what we should try to do. I think we should try to write for the world, write for ourselves, but more than anything, as writers, I think we should write the books we wish existed that don't yet exist.
All right, thank you, Dr. Syjuco. That's all the time we have for the plenary session. We'd like to thank our speakers, National Artist for Literature, Dr. Resil Mojares, Ms. Lualhati Abreu, Mr. Joel Salud, and Dr. Miguel Syjuco. Thank you for attending. Please enjoy the rest of the 10th Philippine International Literary Festival.